All right, in the previous video, we sort of looked at a few of the differences between paths and shapes. And in this video, we're going to look at a more real-world example of how to use the shape tool to create some graphics. So we're going to create a simple button, a web button that we could use on the web for a click now or buy now button or something like that. Maybe we'll do a shopping cart button. And so we're going to use some of those vector tools to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is convert this background layer to a regular old layer, and then we'll go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to come over here to my shape tool and make sure I have the rounded rectangle tool selected, and I'm going to make sure I have this combine layer or new layer option. Whoops, I want to make sure I have a path selected here. It's already on default new layer. Sorry, I said path, but I want to make sure I have shape selected. And for fill and stroke and all this stuff, it really doesn't matter because with live shapes, as we learned, we can change this after the fact. So I'm going to come out here and draw a shape. Now I'm going to do my shape really, really big. Of course, this is much too large for a typical, because I'm at 100% right now, so I'm not zoomed in at all. You wouldn't have a button this big, but it'll help you be able to see a little bit easier for the screencast. So now I've got this shape. I'm going to get my black arrow tool over here in the toolbar. That's A and Shift A will cycle between the white and black arrow tool. And then I'll come in here to my shape properties and manipulate my radius until I'm happy with it. So I'm going to come down. Whoops, I need to undo that and make sure I have this all checked. And I'll come down here and punch this guy, I don't know, maybe around, I guess I'm kind of large, so maybe let's go with 15 pixels. Something like that to start out with as my, normally I do a less radius, but since my button's so large, that seems to work well. And I can mess around here with the width and the height a little bit. I think I'm a little bit too tall, so I'm going to crunch this down just a hair bit. I imagine it may be saying buy now with a little shopping cart symbol or something here that we'll add. All right, so we've got our base shape here. So I'm going to rename this layer. I'm just going to call this button base. And let's go ahead and add a little bit of dimension or gradient to this. Now, because this is a live shape, I can add fills and strokes directly to the shape itself. Or if I wanted to, I can also add those via FX or layer styles, but I'll work with the live shape properties now. So I'm going to come in here to the fill properties. You can also get to these right up here in the toolbar, but there's a few extra things down here. So I'll come to the fill, and let's fill this guy with this is no fill. This is the solid color, the gradient, or a pattern. So I'm going to go with gradient, and I'm going to choose a color here. So let's go ahead and pick a gradient that's just foreground to, I think it's the first one here. It's foreground color to background color. And my foreground's red, my background's white, which is why I'm getting this gradient. Now, if you want to flip the gradient, you can always hit this button right here. This will just reverse it. So, you can see it happening over there. Flip it upside down or right side up. Now, typically you'll have a light source that's somewhere up here. So I want the top of my button, I want it to appear like it's rounded. It's going to have some depth. So the top's going to be lighter than the bottom. Now, a common mistake I find beginners make when they're working with these gradients is they'll say, well, I need a light red and a dark red. So they'll come over here and double click, and they'll just kind of come in here to whatever they have selected inside of Photoshop, and they'll just drag down here. Here's a dark red, and they'll select it. And then they'll come over here, and they'll just sort of say, here's a light red, and they'll hit OK, and they go, okay, great, looks good. But the problem here is I've done what's known as a hue shift, or what I call a hue shift, meaning these two colors of red actually aren't the same hue. They're different hues. So to prevent this, what you want to do is you want to get your main color set first. So I'll come in here. I'll just stick with this red button since that's what color seems to be working. And I'll set the color. And then I want to duplicate this color over here. So I'm going to hold down Option and click and drag this little luggage tag over here to the right, which duplicates it. And I'm going to click on this one and pull it straight down, which deletes it. And then I can grab this one and bring it over here. So now I've got a gradient that's going from the same color to the same color, which is fine, but they're the same hue. That's the important thing. So now I'm going to come over here to this lighter color and double click it to be able to manipulate it. And I'm going to move down here to B mode. So place your option on B mode there, which is the brightness mode. And now notice I get this slider here. And when I drag down, notice my hue value stays at 0, meaning it's at pure red. And I'm on the same hue, I'm just increasing or decreasing the brightness or the light or intensity. You can think about the lightness, I suppose, of that color. So this is what you want to do for your gradients. So I can make this one sort of a light version of that color. Let me zoom back out here. And then I can come into my second color, and maybe I can darken up the bottom a hair bit to whatever really suits your fancy. Now, I'm a fan of subtle gradients. You don't want to have a big gradient like this. That's sort of reminiscent of the 90s, right, when we were making web buttons. So we want to make them a little more subtle, not too much gradient in those. So I'm going to overdo mine just a little bit, otherwise it's hard to see, but you know, just make a nice little subtle gradient inside of there. Okay, so now I've got a gradient going from light to dark, has a little bit of shape in there, which is looking a little bit better. And next, let's go ahead and create our button base. We're going to create this button sort of like a 3D button, maybe not the right word, but it's going to maybe look like the spacebar key on your keyboard. It's going to have a little bit of dimension to it. So let's take this button base layer, and we're going to right click it and just say duplicate layer. And we'll call this button base, maybe shadow. So let's place this one underneath. So I'm going to drag it underneath the button base. And then on this layer, I'm going to just move it straight down. So I hit V to get my move tool, and I'm just going to use my arrow keys and just nudge it straight down. Now, it's kind of hard to see right now because the two are overlapping, but we're going to take this button base and maybe we'll apply a filter to it to darken it up. So let's come in here and see what filters we have that may help us out. There's several that we could pick here. We could do a levels command, brightness, contrast, even curves, exposure, vibrance might even do it. There's a lot in here that we could actually use. Let's go ahead and go with, let's just do an easy one here. Maybe let's just underexpose it. So I'm going to choose exposure. And notice this exposure layer is just right above my button base. And so I'm just going to darken this up. I'm just going to take the exposure down. And you can see right away that this is applying itself to the back to the, well, essentially all layers below, right? That's the way that these layers, not layer styles, these, I'm blanking on the name, adjustment layers work. They affect all the layers. So in a second here, I want to clip this, but right now let's just make it a little darker like so. And then to clip this, you can either right click and say create clipping mask, or you can hold down Option until you get this little icon that looks like that, and single click. And now I've clipped it so that this adjustment layer is only affecting this single layer below it. So in other words, my white background is also not being underexposed like it was previously. Okay, so now that I have that clipped, I can come in here and mess around with my exposure to, to make that darker, a little bit lighter. Maybe that was a little too dark before. So something like that makes me happy. And then you can come down here and, if you want it to be a bigger, thicker button or a less thick button, or however you really want this guy to look, you can just shift this up and down a little bit using your nudge tools. Okay, so I'm starting to get my rough shape here of my button, which is looking okay. And I still think that my button base is still a little bit too tall. So I'm going to come in here to my top layer and I'm going to take this down to maybe 95. And then I'll move this layer back up. Of course, I've got to now decrease it as well because it's now too tall. That looks a little bit better. Okay, so now let's add a little bit of highlight. And we're going to do this in sort of a unique way. And the reason why is because there's a few gotchas when you start working with strokes on live shapes. I'm going to illustrate the problem here on this next layer. So let's say that I wanted to add a bit of a highlight. Up here, I'll zoom in a hair bit. Let's say I want to take and add a little bit of a shine to the top half of my button to help with that highlight. You could do that with a stroke. So if I come in here and I say, okay, let's add a stroke. So I'll turn on my stroke. Let's say I'm just going to add a white stroke for now. And I'm going to make my background layer actually black so we can see this. Or, whoops, that's not black. Some dark color besides white. So I add a white stroke in there and I go, oh, perfect, that's exactly what I'm after. But I don't want the stroke on the bottom. I want just the stroke on the top. And the nice thing about strokes is they can be gradients. So I can turn this stroke, instead of a solid white color, I can make it a gradient. And I can make my gradient go from white. So I've just clicked here in the gradient editor. I'm going kind of quick, but we have quite a bit to do here. This is going to be a long video. And I'm like my gradient white to white. And then I can take this color, and the bottom colors are the gradient stops, the top colors are the opacity stops. So I can take the opacity of the bottom color stop, which is right where I'm at right here. You can see those two, and take that down to 0. And now we're getting this gradient that sort of is only applied to the top half of the image, or guess whatever I'm trying to say there. I think you can follow along there. And so I can take this one also and take this gradient and take its opacity down a little bit too. But you see, the problem is when I start to decrease the opacity of this, it's actually shining through. It's like cutting a hole into the background here. It's a little bit hard to see. Maybe if I make this stroke a little bit wider, we'll be able to see it. You can see the issue here where it's cutting through there. So I could set this to the inside or the outside. So let's set this to the inside, which is where I want it. But I don't know, this is kind of a weird thing that I'm not quite sure what's going on, but you can really still see it there. Let me turn off this pixel grid. It's under View, Show Properties. Let's come over here and turn off the pixel grid. But you can see that that stroke is not on the inside of the shape like it's supposed to be. I'm going to turn off that background base so we don't see that. But so as I start to decrease the opacity here of the stroke, it looks weird. It doesn't work. So what I need to do is I need to do the stroke in a different way. And so we're actually going to do this with a pixel-based layer here in a second. So moral of the story is it doesn't work how you'd think it would work using a stroke that's semi-transparent like that. So I'm going to go back here to my stroke, all that work. I probably should have told you we're going to throw it away, but I just wanted to illustrate the issue. And then we're going to turn back off the stroke. Okay, so now I'm going to take my button-based layer and I'm going to duplicate it. So I'm going to right-click and I'm going to say Duplicate Layer, and I'm just going to call this one the button stroke. And this one's going to sit on top. Now this layer right here, remember, it's still a live property, so I can still manipulate its shape. If I turn off all these other ones, it's still sitting there. So I want to turn on a white stroke, and I'm going to set this stroke just to, for right now, 1. Whoops, I hit wrong key. I hit F1. 1 pixel stroke, and that should be fine. Make sure it's set to the inside. I'm going to turn off the fill altogether so it doesn't have a fill. Now I can turn these back on and we can see there's the 1 pixel stroke. And on this new layer, I'm going to decrease the height by 2 pixels. So I'm going to go to 93. And I'm going to decrease the width by 2. So this is going to go to 47. And we'll tab over and tab over. Now I'm going to zoom in so you can see. Whoops. We'll zoom in here so you can see. All right, so now I'm going to take this button and I'm going to move it down the entire layer with my move tool. I'm going to nudge it down 1 so that it's not all the way against the top. And looks like I accidentally undid that change I made to the width, so I've got to redo that. There we go. And I'll nudge it over 1. So essentially you can see what's happening here is now my stroke is inside the layer there by 1 pixel. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to apply that same gradient to my stroke. So I'll come in here, I'll choose my gradient, and I'll set my colors both to white, and I'll choose my opacity here for my first one and set that down to 0. Okay, so now you can see it sort of fading out to nothing there, and it's a little bit inside as well. And then I can take that entire layer and I can mess around with the opacity if I want to just decrease that a little bit so it's not quite as intense. I just kind of want a little shine up there to hint at a bit of a highlight. So when I zoom back out, you can just barely see that little bit of a shine there, right up in there. And you can mess around with the size. Maybe 1 pixel's too little. Maybe I can crank that up to 2 pixels for a little bit more of an edge up on the top. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better there. And now let's go ahead and add some text. We're going to inset the text inside of the button and add our custom logo shape. So a couple more steps here. Again, I'm going to do this one in a big long video. Normally I'd break these up, but since it's just a single kind of quick exercise, we'll just keep cruising through here. All right, now let's add our text. So I'm going to take all these layers and I'm going to group them into a folder just so I don't get too messy here, and I'll just call this thing the button. And we'll create a new layer here, and this is going to be my button text. So I'll grab my text. I'll come out here and just write something by now or something. Whatever you want your button to say. Whoops, wrong key there. Oh, undo, I just deleted my text. I'm going to free transform it, Command T, hold down Shift, drag it up, do a little bit bigger of a size. I'll double click this, maybe come over here and make this bold or semi-bold or something. Font, looks like I've got Myriad Pro as my font there, which is fine. For now, you can pick whatever font, of course, you want. All right, so I'll leave the text over here, which looks okay. And now I'm going to add some sort of little shape over on this side. So I'll come over to my shape tool again, the vector tools, and I'll come down to the custom shape tool. And we'll open up the shapes inside of Photoshop. And I'm not sure which one I'm looking for. I'm going to maybe try to find a dollar sign or a shopping cart or something. I don't know if there is one built in that does that. So I'm going to hit all and just replace what I have with all of the ones that are built into Photoshop. You can, of course, download shapes galore from the internet if you want to go search for one and download and import it into here. I don't see a little cart. I'm looking for those little shopping cart icons, but I don't see one in here. So maybe we'll, and I don't want to take the time to custom draw one for sure in this video. So we'll just, let's say, I don't know, maybe we're booking a flight. So maybe I'll change the word buy to book. So I'm going to grab an airplane in here and come over and throw it this way. I'm going to flip this guy. So I'm going to select it and I'm going to say edit, transform, flip vertical. So it's pointing, just kidding, flip horizontal. I always guess wrong on that. There we go. So it's pointing the other way maybe. And then I'll change my text from buy maybe to book. Now, guess I'll stay in all caps. And we'll keep hitting the wrong key there. Free transform, Command R to change that down a little bit. Apply that command with Command Return. All right, so now I've got my two little shapes in here. I know I'm going pretty quick here, but I want to make these now inset into the button. So to do that, we'll add a few layer styles to finish this off. So I'm going to take, let's start here with we'll just start with the shape and then we'll copy them over to the book now. So I'm going to come in here to my FX. Now there's so many ways you can create the little inset effect. I'm going to do I don't want to go through the process of doing a little bit finer one, so I'm just going to cheat, if you will, and use a simple bevel and emboss. And so this will give us a similar effect, maybe not quite as nice as the manual way, but it works. So we'll get bevel and emboss. I'm going to switch this instead of inner bevel. We're gonna switch this to a, where's the pillow? There we go. A pillow emboss. To sort of get, actually we're not gonna do that. We're gonna stick with emboss. Sorry, I said emboss, but I meant outer bevel. Move that to outer bevel, but instead of having the angle at the top left, we're going to switch the angle here, keep hitting the wrong key there, to the bottom right. Okay, and you can see that starts to create that inset feel. So I'm going to switch this to bottom right, and I'm going to take the depth way, way down, and the size of that way, way down. I just sort of want a little bit of a crisp edge. And you can sort of play around with these values until you're happy with something. Maybe that highlight color I want a little bit brighter. Same with the darker. Anyway, play around with these a hair bit until you get a little bit of an inset feel. You'll want to go back out to 100% to kind of see what that inset looks like there. When you're messing around with your settings, don't preview it all zoomed in because that's not how it'll look, of course. Anyway, play around with these. I'm not going to do much more here. I'm just going to call that good. So Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click these effects and say copy effects, copy layer style. I'm going to come over here to the book now text, right click and say paste layer style. So it basically is going to copy those same effects down to that one. And that's looking just about right. Now I think I need to darken up the bottom of my base a little bit. So I'm going to still decrease that a hair bit. I'll take this back to white. It's what it looks like on white and black. See the difference in the contrast there for the button. And now we'll take all of these layers and we're going to group them, and we're just going to call this thing button. Okay. And I'm going to take my button layer, my button group, and right click it. We're creating an overstate now for our button, or when the user hovers over this. We're going to duplicate that entire group, and we're going to call this button hover. So now I've got my two groups that are identical. I'll unvisibilize the button layer, and I'll just turn on the visibility of the button hover, fly open that group, and I'm going to come in here and change the color of the text. So I'm going to come double click the text, and when they hover over my button, I don't know, maybe I'll just go with a light white or something for the hover color. I'll do the same thing for the shape here. So I'll come into my shape. I'll change its fill color to match the same white there. I think I just went with solid white. And we'll take off that bevel and emboss. I think it kind of looks funny still inset. I don't know, maybe we could leave it. I guess it really doesn't matter all that much. Anyway, so now we have our button normal and our button hover. And just because we can, because we have two states here, let's create layer compositions out of these so that we can pass it off to a designer and they can quickly see what that looks like. So I'm going to come open up my layer comps window, and I'll create my first state. I'll just look at my normal button, which looks like this, and I'll create a state. And I'll just call this button normal. And I'm going to make Photoshop remember all of these things and hit OK. For my second state, I will turn off that and turn on this and create a new layer comp. We'll call this one button, what do I call that? Hover. And hit OK. And now we can cycle between the two. So that's what layer comps do for you. If you've never worked with those, I can also use these arrows. So a designer doesn't have to kind of come in here and, you know, toggle and try to see all these things. They can easily see, here's what the button looks like normal, and here's what it looks like when it's hovered over or something. Anyway, so that was a bit more of a practical example of using some of those shapes and a few effects to create a simple web button graphic. Now, if you want to relive the what they called Web 2.0, or the, I don't know, the glossy phase of the web, which I, of course, am still stuck in, we can make this button a bit shiny, and it's really easy to do. So I'll show you how to do that lastly. Again, this is probably optional here. Unless you're me, then it's mandatory. So we're going to create, we'll do this with a pixel. And the reason why I'm showing this is I think it illustrates a few techniques that are helpful in Photoshop, not necessarily the graphics. So what I want to do is I'm going to come to this button, and I'm going to hold down Command and click on my button base layer, because that brings up the marching ants around that original shape. And now that I've got some marching ants, I'll create a new blank layer, and I'm just going to call this layer gloss, and use a couple of tools here, and we'll practice our selection modes. So what I want is I want to end up with a selection that's only the top half of my button without the bottom half, but I do want these curves. So I can come in here to my marching ants tool and get my rectangular marquee tool and switch to subtraction mode, or you can hold down Option is what I'm going to do, which is the same thing. So I'll hold down Option. You can see that jumped over to the subtraction. Start here in the bottom left and just click and drag up over halfway. I'm going to move halfway through my text, about right there for me, and let go. So that subtracted out the bottom half of my pixels, or my marching ants, leaving me with just the top half. Now that I have this top half highlighted and I have a blank layer, I can go ahead and add my gloss. And that's simply done with just a gradient. I just go ahead and grab my gradient tool. And again, now we're working with pixels. We're not working with layer styles and gradient fills. We're just a regular gradient tool here. And I'll come in here and I'm going to pick this second preset, second chiclet here, which is foreground to transparent. And I'll make sure that my foreground color, I'll hit OK, set my foreground color to white and my background color to white. So it's essentially going from, if I look here at my preview now, my gradient's going from white to transparent. And now that I have that set up, I hold down Shift, which is going to make me draw my gradient in a linear straight line. Start somewhere up here above, click and hold down, and end somewhere right below. And you want to make sure to make the gloss, you want to get a line. You actually want to see that line. So if you mess it up, just Command Option Z or a few times to back up and try it again. So maybe I'll drag down a little bit farther that time. And now I've got that nice hard line, which is what I was after. And once you've got that gloss line, of course, this is way too intense. But you can just take that entire layer and back down the opacity a little bit. If I don't want it part of the words, maybe I want the words outside of that, I have to take this layer and stick it underneath the words there. So it's not part of that or that. And then I can, again, mess around with the opacity a little bit. So anyway, and then you guys sort of have that little gloss effect that you see all over the place that is just awesome. All right, that's it.